Gresham College presents Leading at the Top, Part 4, Panel Discussion. I've Got the Power, Now What? With Dr. Douglas Board, Simon Corkin and Dr. Liz Mellon.
Well, thank you very much for your punctuality, everyone, and welcome back to the discussion session, which is going to follow the two excellent presentations that kick things off. We've entitled this panel, I've Got the Power, Now What? And whilst a symposium such as this is not really directive, certainly one of the things we're quite interested in is what you, the audience, feel we ought to do. And to kick things off a bit, we have the usual audience plant in the form of Simon Corkin, who is, I think, going to kick off with a few remarks that he's got based on what he's heard this afternoon. Simon.
Thank you. The two tour de force presentations, which are quite difficult to follow, but I think they illustrate, for one thing, the perennial fascination and trickiness, and perhaps also hint as to why they're so fascinating and tricky, is the subject of, and so elusive, is the subject of leadership. I looked up leadership on Amazon, just the UK version, and there are 64,000 references there, so we're not short on reading. And it's one of those subjects which seems to me that the more you look at and the more you read about it, it's very easy to find it doesn't get easier, it gets more difficult the more you read about it. However, the two presentations this afternoon I thought were absolutely fascinating. And I'm sort of wondering whether one of the problems with leadership, one of the things that makes it so difficult, is that, in fact, I'd like to suggest another way of looking at it, which is that it's an epiphenomenon, that is to say, like happiness and profits. It's a byproduct of doing something else, and a byproduct of doing something else well. I was reminded, when I was thinking about this, of a quote that I picked up from Martin Corrie, who was the captain of the England rugby team at one point, and he had this to say about captaincy. It's a simple matter of making sure everyone knows what he's supposed to be doing and then letting them do it. After that, it's about maintaining your own standards, which is the most obvious way of winning the confidence of those about you. It's obvious to me that you can't have a captain the majority of the dressing room think is a tosser. How can you stand up and say your piece in a team meeting if you're playing like a twit every weekend? Your performance carries the weight of everything. That's all you need to remember, basically. Now, that's clearly something of an oversimplification, but I was struck by that, and I think it has something to say there. And of course, in companies, and particularly very large companies, the leadership role acts as an amplifier, as a multiplier of the effect that the performance actually carries, as Liz referred to. And so I think maybe if you combine with the amplifier effect the errors you're getting on the selection process and the errors that you're getting in the competence model of leadership that is being used, maybe this is how you get into some of the leadership problems which seem all about us at the moment, whether it's the BBC, whether it's thinking back to the the financial meltdown as well. So, which our leadership failures writ in the hugest possible letters. So I'd really be very interested to know what both Liz and Douglas think each other's presentations, how they make them think of their own, what they've been presenting. So I'd really like to stop there.
Liz, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, so I'd love to. Shall I? Thank you. I think what we underestimate. Am I too loud? No, okay. I sound very loud in my own ears. I think what we underestimate is the amount of politics and intuition that actually does play the role, you know, as Douglas said at the very top, in all kinds of ways. You know, the process, for example, of becoming a non-executive director. So you're a CEO, you've done it for 2-3 years, now you're looking around saying, okay, what do I do if I ever have to step down from this? Let's hope it's not too soon, but what do I do? And of course, it's a process of having lunches with people. And chats with people, and somebody knows somebody who knows somebody who thinks you might be quite an interesting person to talk to. So it is very much a networked political activity is the first thing. So and you know, we can have a long discussion about what intuition is, but our intuition is at least at one level, what one hopes informed by experience. So the fact that you can kind of at another level, it's just a completely emotional response, but at some level intuition is also informed by experience. So in some ways I don't mind it getting away from the science, because the science is over-engineered and deeply flawed and can produce people who can't, you know, couldn't take a decision to get themselves out of a brown paper bag. So I don't mind so much that it is about politics and intuition, except that it's such a closed society. We never get behind the scenes. And if you do get behind the scenes, you're sworn to secrecy and not allowed to say what you see. And no one breaks the vow of silence, because it is a network. And if you rat, following on the same terminology, if you rat, you're out of the club, and that's it. You don't stand a chance at all. So in all that, are the best candidates always chosen? Well, absolutely not. You know, I'm working with one CEO at the moment, and it's well known that he cannot manage conflict. Now, you know, that's a pretty basic requirement that you wouldn't, you know, that you'd be tested at in a junior management level. Why doesn't it matter? Well, because actually, although he's the CEO, you're not alone. There is this network of people at the top running the organisation. Now, if anything goes wrong, he'll have to resign, you know, on a good day with a following wind, because they don't always resign these days, but he would be the figurehead who would resign, and, you know, then it would all have been cleaned up and we'd move on. But organisations at the very top of political networks.
And Douglas, your reaction to this?
I think what I found particularly striking for me from Liz's is, because I've worked a lot in recruiting and I've seen competencies and so forth mainly in that framework, this is a great reminder that actually this behavioural stuff, has spread like wildfire. And actually most global organisations and most large organisations now pride themselves on having got joined up frameworks of competencies that go from when you're selected through to talent management, training and development, selection for promotion, through to the very end. It's become a very, very powerful tool, and I think in the book I talk a little bit about why that might have been so. And I think one of the reasons it was so was that HR directors found it something that CEOs liked to hear. I mean, HR departments are weak. They don't often have stuff that CEOs want to listen to. So actually, if you go to your CEO and say, I've got this stuff, which is best practice HR, where basically we can manage our human assets, and we start using phrases like this, we can see where our competencies are, where they aren't, where the gaps are, and we can manage it all, and we somehow along the way forget that it's people, doing things with people. So I particularly took, it is absolutely a huge thing that we are both tilting at, in terms of competency frameworks and the received way of how to do good people management.
So I was just going to say, and the fun thing is, it's like, a bit like a vision statement. If you put a vision statement up and you take the company logo off and you've got 50 CEOs in the room, half of them will claim it's their vision statement. It's the same with the competency frameworks, you know. They all look pretty much the same, but can somebody who works in I don't know, in AIG work in LG? No, wouldn't be transferable. But if you look at, you know, so...
Could I just make one other comment, which I thinking about the politics as well, it is actually quite surprising how little that sort of frame, that prism, is used to look at what happens in companies, because at the kind of larger level, it's quite surprising, though we, you know, thankfully live in democracy, we do accept one area that's absolutely not a democracy and is actually the last vestige of central planning, if you look at it in one way, and that's the big corporations. What's more, they're often de facto dictatorships, and one consequence of that is that change happens, as in other kinds of dictatorship, by revolution, once everything has gone completely pear-shaped, rather than gradually and in time, before the crisis happens. There's just one company that I know of in the world, and there's probably others, where somebody wrote that actually change at the top is about as difficult and makes about as much difference as changing a light bulb, and that company is Toyota, which probably none of us could actually say who the chairman was. But that's a different kind of politics than a very different kind of politics, and it obviously has huge implications for leadership.
Well, it's over to you. Can I have a show of hands of those who'd like to make some comments or questions? Okay, well, we'll start at the back for a change. So, Lauren, to your left and your right, I think. I'd like to take comments. Firstly, would you please identify who you are and any affiliation you might wish? And secondly, do keep it to the point, because I'll try and take them in groups of 3 so that we get more audience participation. Sir.
Right. Name's Ian Potts. I suppose I ought to declare, I'm about to ask the question, I'm a politician. And it strikes me that we've just heard 3 people now at the top there referring to politics, but actually, in the small p, but in big P, we actually, the most important leaders are political leaders. And for that, we trust the electorate. Does this not make a case for actually in companies asking the shareholders or the workers or the customers to actually select the leaders?
Interesting. Sir?
Dr. Mellon, Derek Grover. Dr. Mellon spoke of the some of the most successful leaders as being those where the organization believed they did it themselves. Would you say that the leader cultivates this attitude, or is it sort of part of their innate behavior?
Great. There was a hand at the back.
Sorry, can you show your hand? Who is that?
Gary, just there, Lauren.
Gary Hoffman, retired. The two questions. At any point in the selection process for the following 3 years, are any of you people invited to evaluate the quality and product of the so-called leader? And does anyone remember Neutron Jack and his style of running General Electric selection processes?
Okay. So there you go, folks. That's a bit to get into. Political leaders doing it themselves, post-evaluation, and Neutron Jack. Who'd like to stick a hand up? Liz.
I'd love to. It's absolutely fascinating, Adrian, this, you know, how we choose leaders. One of the biggest studies was done on John Kennedy, and people were asked why they voted for him. And that's where we get all the research, the basis of the research about impression management, because 7% of people said they voted for him based on his policies. And the other 93% said either he looks like a leader or he sounds like a leader. There's a huge piece, there was a huge study at Harvard where an interviewer is interviewing someone for a really senior position. It's costing a lot of money to do this, not quite as many surveys and competency statements as Douglas talked about, but it's an expensive appointment. You're interviewing this person for an hour. You have an hour with them, right? And you've got your whole, hopefully you've prepared, hopefully you've read the CV, you've got some questions to ask. You're given a buzzer under the table, and at the point where you decide whether the candidate is suitable or not, you press the buzzer. Average time to decision, 4 minutes. Average time to decision, 4 minutes. And what the interviewer then does for the rest of the hour, hour and a half, however long this painful process is going on, is they're gathering evidence to prove to themselves that their first intuition was right, and discarding information which would suggest that their first intuition was wrong. So we are pretty hopeless at decision makers. All the bias, all the prejudice, all the stuff that we load into it, and we're sitting there ticking off things saying, I'm being very rigorous here, but in your head you've already decided. It's frightening. In some organisations, I say to people, well, how long would you take? And some people say, 30 seconds. I pride myself on my decisiveness, and my response to that is, my goodness, if I trip over the carpet on the way to the desk, I've blown the interview, right? I'll never get it. We take decisions based on, and so the other piece about impression management, 15%, this is American, 15% of the male population, just looking at male population in America is over 6 foot. 60% of American CEOs, male, are over 6 foot. It does not say anywhere in that competency statement, must be a tall guy, right? Honestly, picking leaders, the electorate's as good as anyone else, I would have said. A leader does it better. This is Derek's question. A leader does it better where the organisation. Sorry, do you want to come in on that one, Douglas, before I move on to the next question? Is that okay? Is that the best way? A leader is at best where the organisation does it themselves. There's a wonderful piece of research written by someone called Jim Collins from Great to Good, and he looks very carefully at some of the attributes of leaders. Humility, which was a mindset I talked about, is part of your solid core is humility. It keeps you open to whoever that is. You're going to have to sing your ringtone now. Stand up and sing your ringtone. Come on, name and shame. Sing your ringtone. One of the things that these CEOs were very good at in Jim Collins' research was when something goes wrong, you look in the mirror, and when something goes right, you look out of the window and say, you lot did a great job. So I think one of the antidotes to fear in the modern organisation is actually that people believe that they have the right to take action and that they feel that ownership for taking action. It's much, much better. One person, 100,000 people, you can only crank a little tiny handle. You've got to hope that that then spins around and that everybody wants to do something for the good. Otherwise, you're lost. So I absolutely believe an organisation where you can give people responsibility and authority and a belief in their own ability to make a difference is absolutely critical. And the last one, Gary's point about do you ever go back and reevaluate? One of the things I do is an interview 360. So 360 is where, everybody has an opinion around you. You're in the middle of it and everyone gives their opinion of what you're like. I do this quite frequently, not as frequently as I'd like, but quite frequently for serving CEOs. And it's if I'm lucky, they'll let me ask their exco, but normally they're a bit worried about, the politics there. So very often it's their outside either CEOs at the same level as them or people who are advising them on M&A or their lawyers and so on to help them calibrate how they're doing. And the chairman is usually involved in that as well. It doesn't happen as often as it should. I think it's a great mechanism. And Neutron Jack is a reference to Jack Welch, who was the manager of the century, last century, the very famous CEO of GE, and he was called Neutron Jack because in his first period of cost-cutting, he had the effect of a neutron bomb because the buildings were left standing, but all the people were gone. He cleared out huge amounts of people. I think the thing about Jack Welch and why he was voted the manager of the century is because he reinvented himself every 10 years. So he was most famous as he left for actually being a great developer of people, a great mentor of people. And now, of course, he's in his giving back phase and he's written his books and he's going around the world. He's created his foundation and he's giving money back. But I think leader as learner is something that's really, really important that we can learn from Jack Welch because the world moves on the whole time. So as leaders, we need to keep ourselves up to date as well.
Okay. Douglas, can I hold for a second and just get some more comments and then we'll turn to you if we might. Can I have a show of hands? So, gentleman here, gentleman out front, gentleman at the very front, and I'll turn to you later. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, I'm Duncan Piper. I run an organisation called the Young Leaders Consultancy. And I'm really interested in your take on leadership education. I mean, we've talked a lot about how we measure leadership and how we get leaders into top roles. But I'm quite interested in how you think that we can actually develop leadership more effectively in this country to create the kind of people that we all want to see running our organisations.
Thank you.
Paul Shari, as I was listening initially to Liz Mellon, and perhaps in a slightly macabre frame of mind, I kept thinking of individual people to whom the criteria would apply. Someone whom others follow, someone who makes change happen. I kept coming back to Adolf Hitler. I wonder, therefore, and maybe this should be the subject of further research by somebody, what his selection process was as I listened to Douglas Board.
Well, those of you who are familiar with Godwin's law, which contends that no online conversation can go on without mentioning Hitler at some point, I think we've reached there very rapidly. Ian Harris.
Yeah, I'm Ian Harris from Zien Group. Actually, I had two thoughts. One peculiarly links to the last one. My first thought, I'd be quite interested when we're thinking about large organisations in your reflections on the CEO as leader contrasted with the chairman as leader, because I think there might be some interesting distinctions to be drawn there. And then just taking that thought forward without thinking about Hitler, I was thinking in terms of large organizations, there's no sort of one individual leader, and therefore when you're selecting a leader, is there a sort of precautionary principle to it, which is that almost it doesn't matter, just make sure you do no harm and make sure that you've got a sort of, a figurehead standing there who can say the right things at the right times and let people get on with their jobs. Is that a very negative take on this, or is there some veracity in that?
I think we can squeeze one more in, Lauren. Lady here in the middle.
Thank you. My name's Gillian King, and I'm currently working on a book on Black identity. I was interested to hear from your presentations that the way that people are selected at the top means that there's a lot of arbitrariness in the selections. And so that sort of correlates, excuse me, with all the, data that comes out that shows that there are less women in boardrooms and a very small percentage of black and ethnic minorities in leadership, in top leadership in Britain. I wonder if any of these changes that are being suggested would change that dynamic, and especially in light of the recent thinking about bringing quotas in, which I'm against, by the way, for women in boardrooms. I wonder if the panel could comment on that.
Well, that's a lot to go on then. So leadership education, the role of how did Hitler get his job? The large chairman versus CEO, who's the leader there? The do no harm principle, and are some of these suggestions for or anti-diversity? As chairman, I'd like to just throw one more straw onto this camel. Well, no, just listening. Certainly when I'm talking to people, and Douglas, you in particular mentioned the kind of $1 million fees for just regurgitating the short list they already had in mind. And I've certainly seen that, but I hear repeatedly, oh, that's the proper process. That it would be corrupt to actually go and talk to the people you might want if you don't inject a headhunter somewhere in between. And I'm also seeing these days a lot of use of web-based tools, particularly for entry level in large organizations, where as recently as 15 years ago, a word in the ear of HR might have had an effect. Now it's cut down. And we seem to be professionalizing HR or institutionalizing what is arguably the most important thing, top to bottom, which is choosing from leaders on down to the entry ranks. And we're leaving this in a cadre of people who are exhibiting your kind of pseudoscience methods without working out. So I'm kind of curious how much of this is actually due to the procurement attitudes we have as opposed to bad science, perhaps. So Douglas, over to you.
I get first. I'm going to have a go at some of those and then just pass
stop.
the ball.
Stop when you need to stop.
Just firstly on leader education, because I'm involved in that at Cowes Business School, and I would certainly encourage that in bringing in real live leaders who don't have to be enormous names to talk about experiences, if one can set that up in such a way that they are really encouraged to talk about, yes, when they failed, also their struggles and fights and things like that, and just make it a lot more real and not contribute as much as might otherwise happen to this apparent glorification of the immaculate. I think that I've experienced that as being quite powerful for students to get the opportunity to hear that from a real person. And to realize that those experiences are available from people who've done quite serious leadership jobs, but are not necessarily world famous. On diversity, well, absolutely. I think that what I have been pointing to just strengthens the hands of all of us, and I will say us there, who want to see some rapid change. I think what I'd highlight is that one of the traps of management thinking is we fall into what I call the pseudoscientific or scientific mindset. So, for example, let's think about the concept of merit as it's related to non-executive, finding people to serve as non-executives on boards. If we're not careful, we start thinking that there is an objective idea of merit and that people must be found and measured against it. This is Cinderella, basically. And that quotas and things like that, are against the idea of merit. But what we have to keep reminding ourselves is that what merit is itself debatable. And not just debatable, it must be contested. To put it quite simply, it would be more than reasonable for society to turn around to companies now or in a couple of years' time, and say, well, if your idea of merit on boards means that we have still only 15% or whatever of women as non-execs, and of course in the FTSE 100 we're just sinking from 3 to 1 women CEOs right now, then it's your idea of merit that needs to change, and that is not a corruption of merit. That's not appointing people who aren't good enough. It's saying there's something wrong with the slipper that was being held out. If I can just attempt to link Hitler with the question about politics, because obviously Hitler got his job through political process, whipping up mass hysteria and finding enemies, which is a very popular and effective way of winning political contests. I'm frankly very torn. I mean, on the one hand, you look at something like our own political processes or US presidential election, and I just weep, because it's a process of buying power as far as I can see. How much money can you raise? And how is that a help to anybody? But something that the corporate world could learn from the political world. So in the political world, we have the leader of the opposition as a paid-for state post in Britain. Because we realise that in a party political process, that contestation is of the essence of democracy. And what we probably need in the boardrooms, and maybe on executive teams, is to find some corporate way of doing that. It wouldn't be a leader of the opposition, it wouldn't work. That idea on its own wouldn't work in corporations. But somehow we need to get a different take on conflict and contestation. Because at the moment, people are just trained. There's this ludicrous thing, if I come to Ian's point about between CEOs and chairs. I loved this bit in the Walker report 2 or 3 years ago, which looked at corporate governance, how British banks and all that got into the terrible mess they did. And a key bit running through the report is about inadequate challenge from non-execs. And look what the report says. The report basically says, well, we should have these execs, very experienced execs, and then they should come onto the board, and then they should be very good challengers, and the chairs should be very good facilitators of constructive challenge. But nothing in the executive careers of these people has prepared them for really serious constructive challenge in the leader of the opposition sense in the political world. You're allowed a certain amount of challenge in the corporate life, and then if you step beyond that, your career is going to be terminated, you know, fairly abruptly. So I think there probably are things we can learn from the party political world. And lastly, Michael, regurgitated shortlists and so forth. Remind me of your point about it, though.
No, I was just wondering how much this was actually due to sort of false views of what proper procurement, what constitutes proper procurement.
I think anything that contributes to us not realising that it's as... Yeah, now let me give this answer to it. One of the things, changes of attitude I'd really like to see us make when we make a senior hiring decision is to realise it's not just about whether that person that we choose is going to succeed. Whoever we appoint, we are then going to do this with them. Now, I think the procurement mindset, very much a bit like Cinderella, treats there's an object out there, I'm going to buy this object, like buying a television or buying something, which is going to be the best for my organisation. But that's not a good model for what's going to happen. Actually, when we appoint a senior person, how we as an organisation, we with them together will create the future. That will then later judge as a success or a failure. So I'd want us to get away from a procurement mindset on that.
Simon, did you want to kick in?
Yeah, a couple of things to say on leadership education. I'm fairly politically incorrect on this. I tend to think that education can probably work on the margin, but that leaders tend to be born, not made on the whole. But what research I've seen says that the way you find out whether people do have leadership potential and it can be developed is to give them responsibility in a controlled way as early as possible and work from there. I think that the Hitler example and numerous others show that we should be extremely distrustful we shouldn't glorify leadership, and we shouldn't, the search, Karana's book on Search for the Corporate Saviour is very telling on this. We shouldn't be looking for saviours. We shouldn't be looking for corporate or political saviours, because that's a denial of our own responsibilities. I think everybody has leadership responsibility within the sphere which they do command, and it's extremely dangerous to think otherwise. I don't know whether it's politically incorrect or not, but I'm in favour of quotas, because I think the idea that, back to Douglas's point, but the idea that you're somehow going to diminish the quality of what's going on in the boardrooms at the moment is, well, I say no more.
Okay. And Liz?
Can I have a go at a couple of these?
Sorry, could I just...
Yes, please, Simon, please.
I just want to say, back to the charismatic leaders on a slightly smaller scale than Hitler, but Neutron Jack himself, Jack Welch, is subject to severe re-evaluation himself. And now that, you know, it comes to light how much of GE's profit came through, well, at least manipulating the figures from the banking side, which then had to be bailed out in 2008. And he has stopped writing for Fortune very recently on the grounds that journalists didn't treat him with respect there, which is not very convincing leadership behaviour in my view. Sorry.
Okay, listen.
I just have a go at a couple of those, if I may. So I'm afraid that I'm with you on quotas. I really think that what matters in business gets measured, and if you haven't got a measure, you're gonna get there. We've been stuck in this regard since the 1970s, and the only way to break out of it. Now, I've seen some very clever tactics with the quotas being actually measurements in the senior executives' annual plan, so it's not a public quota. And of course, the EC's just turned down quotas in the boardroom, so we're not even going to get into that debate. But I come back to unconscious bias. If the competency system worked, then we'd have far more women and people of colour at the top of organisations. But it's a testimony to the fact that it doesn't work, because there's your criteria, and it's unconscious bias. What we know is that if you've got a system run by a majority, the minority will appear strange and less qualified. It's just human nature. It's like who you choose to go out to the pub for a drink with and who you don't. You tend to stick with people like you. And we don't even, the thing is, it's not that people are necessarily bad-minded, it's just that they don't even know they're doing it. And one of the very simple tricks that I say with organisations today is, just look at the list. Is there a woman on it? Is there a person of colour on it? Just check. Just ask yourself the question. That's all I'm asking you to do. Just ask yourself the question. And it's made actually a big difference at that very simple level. So I think unless we do something dramatic, like putting in place measures, we're not going to make the progress that we should make because of unconscious bias. And that's where I do try to get together with organisations and look at the culture of the organisation, because that's where the unconscious bias is embedded. We are always looking for the tall white man, frankly, to come and save us. Yeah, go on. You're going to have a go at that.
I was going to try and hand over to the audience a bit.
Oh, can I just have one thing about CEO and chairman? Do no harm, because I don't think we've addressed that one, have we? The do no harm. I don't think it's enough to say do no harm, because at one level you could say, and at only one level, don't shout at me, but you could say that Tony Hayward at BP did no harm. I mean, he was a well-meaning geologist. He was a million miles from the Gulf of Mexico. He never took any of the decisions that, the bad decisions with the suppliers or the risk takers or whatever out there. So at some level he did no harm. Well, he should have done more harm in some sense, or he should have done more good, been maybe more proactive with the big risks in the organisation. I think it's a good starting point. You'd avoid people like Fred Goodwin, maybe, if you started with that principle, but I don't think it takes us quite far enough.
Okay. Some of that discussion there reminded me, one of the more successful computer companies was an Anglo-Dutch firm by the name of CMG, later sold out. One of the more interesting things there was that the leader on any project was the person who was paid the most, and pay was tightly tied to performance in terms of utilization and client satisfaction, which wasn't too bad. It's a highly successful company, and funny enough, most of the people that I stay in touch with from that organization were either women or from minorities. It was actually quite a meritocratic organization in odd ways. But it was definitely an uncomfortable place, because I do recall at one point working alongside them and coming in one day to find out that the project leader had been terminated and somebody else, simply because they posted their 6 monthly salaries and now somebody else was in charge. So that was the consequence of that. Anyway, to the audience, can I have a show of hands? Because we've probably got just enough time for 4 or 5 more. Great. Okay, so Lauren, can we start with the woman here? Who was last? The gentleman here, right, sorry, forward, there we go.
Thank you.
There we go.
My name is Pamela Noble, and I was going to suggest that when you choose leaders, you can show that they're good administrators, but you don't really know whether they're real leaders until you get an emergency and you see how they react to it and overcome the problem. So that, and the other thing I was going to say, that there don't seem to, during all these discussions, there's been practically until right now, no mention of 50% of the population who happen to be female, and many of them are in business, and there is great prejudice against them in the city, about promotions particularly.
Yeah. Lauren, gentleman here. Just hang on a second for the mic.
Darshan Thaniwara, production manager, Local Family TV. You've talked a lot about, obviously, existing companies and leadership. Can you talk a little bit about, obviously, startup companies and CEOs? Because we have a different responsibility, gestation periods and things like that. And leadership style has to be different because, well, you can't be asking people how to do things because they don't know, really.
The gentleman over there in the yellow tie. Oh, sorry.
One of the most, perhaps possibly the most interesting board I sat on was actually almost entirely female, and all the leadership and dominance was female, and it was rather a different dynamic altogether. And I just wondered that aspect of gender, but also more particularly differences in leadership styles and comprehension of leadership between public sector and private boards, and something also that interests me very much, which is different leadership perceptions between East and West, which was touched on a little at one point.
Would you mind just elaborating for a second on maybe a characteristic of a female board that you observed?
Well, it was more efficient. It dealt very effectively with sort of human and staff matters. But when it came, the one thing that was interestingly different as well on the negative side was that when it came to dealing with matters that had already been settled outside, but on which there were strong views, and on which this was a public sector board, it was impossible to actually change someone else's decision. Vast amounts of time were wasted discussing what should have been the decision, as opposed, which was something we had absolutely no control of.
Okay. And there was a fourth hand, the gentleman just behind you, Lauren.
Hi, Tony Wale. I had a question about, ties a bit the different conversations, but when we talk about politics, I tend to think leaders are well aware they are in some manner politicians. When we talk about intuitions, as was said, the expert is usually aware of being an expert and of relying on intuition. Now the thing is, for me, a lot of boards are made of leaders elsewhere. And it's known like the club of the boys or whatever. And I wonder how much they're aware of their qualities or defects as leaders. Because they're involved in selecting the next leaders, they don't seem necessarily very efficient at it, although they have themselves qualities. So I wonder how much they are aware of their own strengths and weaknesses, or if they're just delusional.
Okay. Well, that's a lot to get into, and I think that. So we had reacting to emergencies, helping with startups, female, male, public, private, east, west, which I think is interesting. In fact, I'd even add to that, do you think there's some industries that need leaders more than others? And then we had sort of self-awareness of strengths and defects. Who would like to kick off? Douglas.
Certainly, I've certainly had experience a lot of times as a recruiter where you would certainly want to understand what experience of emergencies someone had had in their previous career and that went beyond the administrative. That doesn't guarantee that they'll cope with the next one, but you certainly want to know what they've had to deal with before. Startup companies, in many ways, are very different, of course, but then I think there's a common thread which runs all the way through from the startup to these very large corporations, which is the thread around conflict and challenge. Is there going to be any conflict and challenge allowed and overt? What covert conflict and challenge is there going to be? And that all ends up with the quality of decision making that happens in the company. So I think that strand is there, right there. How is that entrepreneur? What kind of discussion are they going to foster? What kind of people are they going to hire? So although some things are different, I see a common thread. On men versus, I'm going to pass on East versus West, but on men versus women, at the gross risk of stereotyping, so let's say up front there are many men who are different from what I'm about to describe as male and many women who are different from what I'm about to describe as female. I was very struck with that qualification that when as a headhunter I talked to senior women to try and interest them in some job, almost always they would want to address two questions right up front. One is, were they capable of doing the job? And secondly, would they actually enjoy doing it, in the largest sense of the word enjoy? In most cases, when I talk to senior male executives, they never ask themselves, it would never occur to them to ask themselves whether they were capable of doing the job. Sadly, I think the second one is changing a bit more. I think more men are starting to ask whether they'd actually enjoy doing the job. So the effective way as a headhunter to sell a job to my stereotypical male exec is to find some way of positioning it as higher in some way. Find some hierarchy, find some way of thinking of things as higher than where that person is at the moment, and then like a salmon they'll go for it like a shot. So that is that. Delusional, I mean the worries that the last person was expressing about how these people who are responsible for selecting their successors and all the way down. Yes, and that's why I used the word crisis twice in my talk, because firstly, they are probably far less self-aware on the whole than most ordinary groups of human beings. I mean, there are rare exceptions, but on the whole, you don't get into corporate boardrooms by having extraordinary levels of self-awareness. They mostly kind of puff up each other's sense of importance. But secondly, and that's where the research crisis comes in, I would defend them to this extent by saying they are not yet being given fit-for-purpose tools to help them make better selection decisions, because the ones that the HR world has produced are mainly fit for junior and middle-level jobs. They don't deal with politics, they don't deal with whatever. And so that's why I think that bit of the crisis, I hope, should be tackled too, and we shouldn't just dump on the people who are in the boardrooms.
Thank you, Douglas. Liz?
Yeah, please, can I? Just fascinating questions. So let me just try a kind of a female thread here. I mean, men and women lead differently. Okay, there may be normal distribution and there's overlap somewhere in the middle, but we know that men and women lead differently. So it doesn't surprise me that your female board was more efficient and very good at staff management. There's been a meta study of 160 studies, which is a bit the research equivalent. If you can't think what else to do, go out and look at everybody else's research. Okay, but anyway, what they found was broadly that men take charge and women take care. And men take charge means that men are very goal-focused. They're good at, they like hierarchies, they like the idea of climbing hierarchies, and they're very good at self-promotion. Women are very good at including people, at making sure that everyone's on board and taking care of people. And there's actually a C factor that groups with women, more women than men, have a higher level of collective intelligence. That's because we listen and we take note of what we hear, and then we kind of build on it. So that's the piece. It all sounds terribly. You could have written this, like 4,000 years ago. Well, it's true. Okay, it is true. One of the things I battle with in developing female leaders is they'll say, "I'm an executive, not a woman," and I say, "Do you have any men at home?" And they say, "Well, yes." And I say, "Well, are there any differences between men and women?" "Oh, of course there are. My husband can't find the butter in the fridge." And I say, "Well, why do you think all those differences disappear when you get to work? Men and women are different. It's something to be enjoyed, and the whole point of diversity is that you've got lots of different skills to bring, and it's a good thing, not a bad thing." Which brings us back to the quota thing. So I think what women are generally bad at is getting feedback. So a man will get feedback and go, "Oh, okay." And then women will go, "I wonder what that meant. No, I really wonder what it meant. No, I wonder what he meant by what he meant. Does he know what he meant? No, it might mean something else." Which is why we revisit. Which is why we revisit the decisions, and go around the loop a little bit, because was that the best decision? Well, maybe it wasn't the best decision. If it hadn't been a Wednesday, we might have taken a different decision. So there's always another possibility. Why did I start that? I'm not quite sure, but I enjoyed it. Anyway, are CEOs of big organisations different than entrepreneurs? Yes. It's not so much they're running an admin shop, but they do have constituencies alongside them. They have to bring alongside them. The small startup, generally, it's the CEO who is running the thing. I mean, that's why Steve Jobs was in and out of Apple, because he wasn't a leader so much as he was a great inventor and a great entrepreneur. But in terms of then living with the politics of Apple and actually running the organisation, you know, he had to be in and out. Have I got time for a last word? I know we're getting edgy on time. East versus West. So I run our Indian office at the moment, and I was giving a talk to 50 Chinese CEOs, the CEOs of the state-owned enterprises. It's a whole hidden area of the world, because these giant organisations, which are 5 times as large as the biggest corporate we have, and probably bigger than 80, generate more money than 80% of the countries on the planet. These huge hidden empires, and they really wanted to understand a Western view of leadership. I would say that the biggest difference at East versus West is that collective cultures really do think about the group first and the organisation first, whereas the I am the enterprise way of thinking, what is good for the whole, is a much harder sell in the Western world. But still, I think, very important. So I would say the collective mindset and humility are probably the biggest differences I find East versus West. And we could certainly learn from each other, I think, in that regard.
Can I make just a quick comment on leadership context, entrepreneurial versus small companies versus large companies? Context is vastly important, which is why it's difficult to, why it's difficult to generalise. I mean, the cliche example is of course Churchill, who was all kinds of failure up till 1939, when he met his finest hour. And so, context is extremely important, which then brings you back, of course, to some of the things that Liz was talking about, and it puts me in mind of the values, the values you espouse can still be the same, whether you're in whatever part of the entrepreneurial or corporate cycle you are. And it reminds me of the Warren Buffett quote about what he was looking for in people he was recruiting. And he said of course they had to have intelligence, confidence and integrity, and if they didn't have the third, i.e. integrity, the other two would destroy them. And I think that's a good comment.
Okay. We have time for just a couple of quick comments, and really just very short ones. So, gentleman at the back, gentleman in the middle, and the gentleman this time with the yellow tie. I did it. So very quickly, though, please.
Okay, Graham Wilson, Oxford. Much of the conversation today seems to have focused around the isolated leader in a hierarchical organisation, and yet many of the most longest enduring organisations, enterprises, are partnerships. And in the last year alone, there's been 3,000 new cooperatives established in the UK. So I just wondered if you'd like to comment on how the nature of leadership and our selection of leaders should change with that new style of approach.
Gentleman here in the middle.
Thank you. Michael Sparks, Bank of New York Mellon. There seemed to be an implied theory there that leaders don't take enough risks. And I wonder the extent to which that's a reflection of today's society being perhaps more moderate than it once was, where left and right are really struggling to occupy the centre ground. perhaps some of the science is people really building a defensible position as far as the decisions that they've been taking. So I'd be interested to hear about that.
Lauren, there's a gentleman here in the middle.
Carl Allen, we seem to go through a great deal of trouble to get a leader, but yet in the first 90 days of leadership, why aren't we going through the same trouble to see if we want to keep the leader?
Very good. And finally, the gentleman here.
Jonathan Price, London School of Business and Finance. It seems to me that one of the most meritocratic large industries we have in this country is sport, particularly football. I wonder if it is so meritocratic simply because it's so transparent. Everybody can see who's doing a good job and who isn't, and that applies both to the players and to the managers. Perhaps meritocratic if you ignore women's football, sorry about that, but as far as the men's game is concerned. And I wonder if football has got anything to teach us more generally.
Folks, I'm going to ask you to not only address some of these, so we had non-hierarchical leadership, less risk-taking perhaps in large organizations today. What about a 90-day trial period? And football, which of course reminds me of the American, I don't know if you read Michael Lewis's Moneyball, where he pointed out that in fact it looked meritocratic in the States, but it really wasn't, and how a small team, I think it was Oakland, developed techniques of picking out some of the outliers and at least went on to win the series for a bit. So I'm going to, if I can, probably go in presentational order. Liz, Douglas, and then Simon, if you could just kind of address perhaps some of those points and then one concluding remark. Liz.
Ooh, it's the concluding remark that's going to get
me. Concluding remark time. 2 minutes.
If you look at the top of global organisations, Graham, there is a network of people running it. There's a face to the public, but there's actually a network, so it's much more like a partnership at the top. When you've got people running countries for you and running big functions for you, it feels more like a partnership. You can't move without them. Risks today, I think leaders do take risks consistently. It's just, for me, it's one of the criteria that makes them a leader. Yes, there's an economic crisis today, but they're still proud of heroic venturing, as the Shakespeareans would say. So they do try new things the whole time. The trouble of getting rid of a leader after the first 90 days is that you've invested so much in that brand and that figurehead that it could be really detrimental to the share price to say, whoops, got that one wrong. I mean, it just creates a crisis of confidence. So better get it right first time rather than getting them out. Football, I agree with the principle of transparency, but football is a simpler game. There are fewer rules, fewer complications, clearer when, the goal is clearer. It was you either did or didn't hit it. It's a lot, business, as you know, is a lot more complicated than that. But the principle of transparency, fantastic. Concluding remark would be, I wish that CEOs were better at letting go of their last job and playing in their comfort zone, and better at being generous with their time in developing their succession right from day one.
Excellent. Douglas.
So in the interest of taking risks, I'll venture a comment upon sport, about which I know absolutely nothing. You described football as meritocratic, and it obviously has some transparent aspects, but I just think about, let's say, the whole England football manager as a trope for leaders and what we consistently keep setting ourselves up to expect from saviours who will arrive and somehow do something magical. So even in sport and even in football, it's perhaps not as transparent as it might look. Can I have a bash at taking together the first 90 days of leadership with one of the other points? The one about taking enough risks. Let's look at the BBC now. Let's look at George Entwistle in his first 90 days. We are in part, as the public, even in private corporations, we are in part to blame for the leaders that we get. We have created a world in which the ability to have a plausible story to explain what it is you did or didn't decide X weeks, Y months, Z years ago, unfortunately seems to become a very big part of people's lives. And And if they don't take enough risks, then maybe that's partly why. On partnerships and co-ops, it made me just think of the times when, as a headhunter, I had the privilege to work for the John Lewis Partnership. I don't have a nice answer, but I have an experience I hope that's relevant. So I used to spend time with candidates, say from other retailers, to try and interest them in positions at JLP, where obviously they're not going to get paid more. And one of the things I basically say to them is, look, think how much money is spent in your company trying to persuade the employees to act as if they were owners. Now, in the John Lewis Partnership, they are. And that means that 4 levels down from you might be someone on the board. Now, do you really want it? Or were you just pretending?
Very good. Simon, last thought on the symposium?
Yes, partnerships and cooperatives, just quickly skim through that. I think probably the thing there is appoint more women. Not enough risk. I think rather the crash proves all the research that's been done since then shows that monstrous risks were taken, and we're still suffering the consequences. Monstrous risks are taken with mergers which we know in very many cases don't pay off. So I don't. There is obviously an important bit about being risk aware, but I don't think there's a problem about lack of risk taking. Football. The thing that strikes me about football is all the research shows that money pays. Whoever has the most money, it doesn't actually matter too much whether they have the right manager in place at the beginning, because they will have, and that manager will eventually spend more money than anywhere else, as Manchester City and Chelsea have been proving, and carry off the Premiership. So I'm not sure what lessons we draw from that for leadership, to be quite honest. The symposium, for me, has been a huge learning experience, and the questions have been great. My concluding thought is that, as Goethe said after reading Hegel, I'm still confused, but at a higher level.
Well, thank you very much, panelists. I just have a minute or so of concluding remarks, if I may, and then some thanks. We opened this with a kind of a Zen view of vision, and Liz touched on what is the right thing to do at one point, and Douglas was almost saying kind of intuition. I still think there's a lot to be said about the kind of do no harm and how we evaluate leaders over time. I'm always reminded of a quote that Savielly Tartakova gave. He was a grand master in chess. The tactician must know what to do whenever something needs doing. The strategist must know what to do when nothing needs doing. And I sometimes think that there's an element of leadership there. I also think we didn't really get into some of the interesting bits here about what is to be learned and in fact not learned from the political process. I think it was Disraeli who said, I must follow the people. Am I not their leader? So you have these sorts of tensions of what you're doing. Douglas left us, I think, with an interesting idea about trying to build a body of narrative research. And I wrote down 7 other little points that I'll mull over, such as fewer candidates for longer evaluation, trying to evaluate people over kind of ranges of risk for the job as opposed to single points. Looking at, and I think I was quite sympathetic to this 90-day, but new ways of getting people into the organization, because one of the things that, certainly as somebody who used to be a partner in a firm, you don't just become a partner in a firm. You've already served your time, you've moved in. The notion of bringing in an outside leader has been, not always, but frequently disastrous for partnerships. and probably cooperatives, though I don't know. The notion of team positioning didn't come up. We have this notion of kind of the board decides, but the board isn't the team working, and sort of the whole politics of boards and their selections. I love the idea of leader of the opposition. This procurement Cinderella, which is in many ways supposedly for and against diversity. And finally, I often wonder in situations where you can't tell the difference, why don't you put a lottery in? So maybe we should just have lotteries for leadership. If we really have no science, roll a dice and decide. Pick the shorter person. So I think those were all there. What I would sum up this afternoon as is, I think the real plea here was more challenge. We need to be much more challenging about the way that we select leaders, the way that we let them run things, and the way that we evaluate them. And perhaps the best leaders are those who succeed in inducing appropriate challenge within their own organizations. So that's what I took away, which is very good, because I wanted to end on a quote from George Orwell, where he says, really in the line of challenge, "High sentiments always win in the end. The leaders who offer blood, toil, tears, and sweat always get more out of their followers than those who offer safety and a good time. When it comes to the pinch, human beings are heroic." And so maybe that challenge is what we should take away. Now, in closing, I have a few sets of thanks to do. Firstly, I'd like to thank the team here at Gresham. Laura, who's dutifully been on her feet, Scott, who's done the AV, James, who's been doing a lot of the event organization with Dawn, and finally Valerie, our registrar. So please come up and say hi to them at the end and tell them how much you appreciated it. But more importantly, I think we all owe a round of thanks to our panelists, Liz and Douglas for preparing such excellent presentations to get us off, and Simon for kicking off the conversation. Could I ask you to join me in thanking them in the usual way?
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.